Paul writes, "As it is, I rejoice, not because you were grieved, but because you were grieved into repenting. For you felt a godly grief, so that you suffered no loss through us. For godly grief produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death. For see what earnestness this godly grief has produced in you, but also what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what punishment. At every point you have proved yourselves innocent in the matter." So here we see that Paul contrasts this godly grief with a worldly grief, right? So let's unpack that a little bit. Worldly grief, let's start there. This is the grief that remains at the level of feeling sorry for one's situation. It's kind of like you regret that you got exposed. Oh man, somebody found out my sin. It's not really upset that they've sinned, it's the upset that they got caught. And now they're going to have some kind of a loss, right? You're sad because you might have to lose maybe reputation, pleasure, job, money, maybe family members over the sin you've committed. There is a real pain, and worldly grief can produce real tears, but it's self-centered. It's about what you have lost or are going to lose and what you would like to keep, rather than how this is a harm against Jesus, against his glory, and it breaks the Father's heart. So godly grief then, by contrast, Paul says it produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret. So godly sorrow is pained over the break in relationship with God, that our sin separates us from him. It's heartbroken that God has been grieved and offended, and that his holy and loving law has been broken. Now, there is, of course, room in godly sorrow to feel sad about hurt relationships or other consequences, but there's a recognition that the greatest pain is over having sinned against God. David has this kind of confession in Psalm 51 where he says, "Against you only have I sinned." He's not disregarding the other things that have happened, but he recognizes that sin is first and foremost an affront to God. And that's what godly sorrow recognizes, godly grief, that we've offended God. And so godly sorrow then, notice here in verse 11 what eagerness this godly grief has produced in you. What eagerness to clear yourselves, right? So it manifests, if you have godly grief, it manifests itself in concrete attitudes and actions. I think of another text, Luke 3:8, where we're told to bear fruits in keeping with repentance. So there is a change from the sinful self-centeredness that would produce worldly sorrow when caught to a pure concern for God and living for his glory. And this is a heart transformation. The heart is being transformed to want to please God more than self. Godly sorrow motivates real and lasting change. So I would just encourage you, if you're still kind of thinking through what is this godly grief, this godly sorrow, really study these 3 verses and maybe read some commentaries on it. Very, very helpful to unpack what does repentance look like.